Hi, this is Parth Chanda. I'm founder and CEO of Lextegrity, and I have the privilege and honor today to have with me Hui Chen, the former DOJ compliance expert. Welcome, Hui.
Thank you for having me, Parth.
Thank you. So this is part three of our three-part fireside chat series with you on how digital transformation can really drive compliance program effectiveness. We'll be focusing today on digital transformation to enable better ethical decision-making by your business. In part one, we did a deep dive into monitoring and auditing of spend data. And part two, we talked about digital transformation in the third-party risk management space. So definitely check those out as well. For those of our listeners who don't know your background, again, you started your career as an AUSA and a trial attorney at the DOJ, and then went on to many years as a compliance professional in-house at Microsoft, Pfizer, Standard Chartered, before you became the DOJ's compliance expert. So you obviously have a tremendous amount of relevant experience from all sorts of perspectives that we're really excited you're willing to share with us today. So thank you again.
It's a pleasure.
So today we'll be talking about the business. Everyone wants their business to own their compliance, but that's the mantra: own compliance, accountability, business accountability, and driving accountability down to the business. But part of me feels like no one really knows how to get there exactly. You were in-house at three large organizations. You saw programs from all sorts of companies while you were at the DOJ. So I'm really excited to hear your views on this topic. So, to dive in, to me, the mantra that the business owns their compliance means that the business is accountable on some level for overseeing compliance within their operations without, compliance having to hold their hands or legal having to hold their hands on, everything. But really, to do so, from my perspective, requires the business having the right tools, which to me means, again, having data at their disposal and being able to use that data. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that generally.
Well, business runs on data typically, right? So most business people, they require data to gauge their performance, to manage their business, their operations, their financial risks. So running business with data is something that's second nature to business. Now, what compliance has not been doing as well is using business as well as compliance related data to put together that big picture that would help business understand their compliance risks. So for example, I remember again very clearly a couple of years ago, someone from a company who started doing which was starting to do sort of data analytics work, told me about how beginning to bring data to the conversation with the business had to completely change their conversation with the business. So, so they would tell, and as I asked them how, what do you mean by that? So they said, we would go to the business and we would say that, we need you to really watch out for this type of marketing events. And the business owner would say, well, I'm not worried about that because we don't really do that much of those type of marketing events. And compliance, now armed with the financial data, says, well, we looked at your cumulative spending for this type of marketing events, and it's, X million dollars last year. And the business owner said, what? I didn't realize we were spending this much money on this kind of marketing events because we actually didn't think it was very effective. Well, we need to shut it down. So they don't even need compliance to tell them this, because they're not actually shutting this down for compliance reasons. They're shutting it down because they didn't want to spend that money. So that, so to me, and the business, having decided that they don't want to spend the money, and now realizing they were spending the money, that was, that really raised that interest to manage that risk. Now, they may be understanding that risk from a different perspective. They're probably more motivated by wasting money than whatever that money could have done in terms of creating risk. But that doesn't matter, because ultimately it's the result that you want. It's them saying, you know what, this can't go on.
That sort of reminds me of, when I was outside counsel and we were advising a company on their third-party risk management around, I think in that specific example, it was around customs clearance. We collected data from the finance organization of all the customs brokers they had. And, it was actually news to the commercial organization that they had all, because they were so decentralized, they allowed the businesses to just willy-nilly hire these vendors. And when they finally saw a holistic picture, they saw markets, tiny markets where they had 9, mom and pop customs vendors. And then on top of that, they had, 2 of the major players. And it sort of raised for all of them, why are we operating this way? One, there's
Exactly.
so many cost savings. Let's go to 2, 3 vendor. Let's rationalize. We don't want to have one and then be in a lurch. Like maybe we have 2, maybe we have 3. But it was a huge win for the compliance organization because it saved the business money. It was kind of their decision, sort of in a backdoor way. Compliance got them where they wanted to get them from a risk management perspective, but the business sort of like owned it. They kind of loved it. They were saving millions of dollars, and sort of ultimately better for the company longer term. So yeah, no, I mean, look, I think again, goes back to what we've covered on some of these other podcasts is, accessing the data and providing the data in a way that the business can use is, I think, the critical piece of this. And, we've talked at length already about how easily some of that can be accessed and analyzed out of the box, even down to segregating data by region. We hear, from people we talk to, concerns about, well, we don't want to show the Brazil finance team Germany's data, which is completely, legitimate concern. And, tools can segregate data. They can segregate by region. We hear from pharma companies, you don't want to show the commercial folks the medical functions data. Completely, again, legitimate. And it's all data that can all be done with tools and segregation, access controls and things like that. The second part of the challenge I hear is this idea that there's this, we may not want to share this compliance data with the business. It's giving them too much. It's giving them, a ways to game the system. That's sort of like, we trust the business and we want them to own it, but we don't really trust them. So, what are your thoughts on that? Like, is there types of data that you wouldn't want to share with the business, and what would that look like? What does that universe look like?
Well, if there is, data that I would be careful about sharing with anybody, it would be sort of personal sensitive type of data that, the data that would have privacy implications. But we have to come back to this point about the data analytics is about putting together the pieces of the puzzle. It's about the big picture. It's not about the raw data. And plus, all the interesting data when it comes to compliance actually comes from the business. So with the exception of investigation data, all the other stuff is actually business data. Financial data is business data. Operational data is business data. So marketing data is business data. So that actually comes from the business. Now, it's a race, I think, really between compliance and other functions to be the one that puts it together, that gives the leadership of the company the big picture. What does this mean? Like the example that you gave with the customs, with the number of customs vendors that they have in different countries, for example, right? So that's never a secret. I mean, that data has been sitting there in the business, like it's in the financial system, in the business system, all that time. But the one that puts it together, that tells a story, the story then impacts business decision, that party will be valued in the company. And I would think if I were a compliance person, I would want to be that party that brings it all together and puts, that actually paints the big picture and the narrative about what do we need to worry about. So it's not really about sharing the data. The data is most of it from the business. It's about the big picture. Now, it's the next question, then it's not really about sharing with the business per se, but it's about who in the business, at what level, right? So at what level is it appropriate and useful for them to get this big picture that the data paints?
Interesting. Yeah. No, so one of I think the idea that you're providing those tools and you're supporting the business and you're going to be very valued. Unfortunately, I think sometimes the compliance organizations don't do that in a positive way and do that more in a command and control sort of policing way, where we're going to insert compliance in the middle of everything because we need to have sort of our view and our hand and everything's got to go through us. So, how do you advise? Because I think a big part of this is really loosening the reins, again, on a risk basis, and allowing the business to potentially approve things that maybe no one in legal or compliance looks at, because it's a certain risk level, or the factors are a certain set of or a certain set where compliance and legal doesn't have to look at it. But I think that's sort of very different from how some organizations look at these things. So how do you advise companies around that, sort of loosening the reins? Because that's sort of part and parcel of giving accountability. It's sort of like when you have a child, you've got to trust them and loosen the reins a little bit if you want them to actually own their own life, be
Well,
accountable for what they
yeah,
do.
and and better yet, like treat your colleagues like your clients, your customers. So I think it was the last chat that we had, part two, that we talked of. I was comparing sort of monitoring with the monitoring that credit card companies do. So do credit cards companies make you, and me, are the customers, go through a pre-approval for every transaction? I mean, have you ever heard of something? I mean, who would use that credit card? So they're running back-end analytics, and they're trying to spot things. If you go over your credit limit, they will probably know it before, as you are hitting close. You'll probably get warnings. I have not actually come close to my credit limits, so I don't know what happens when you get close to credit limit. But I imagine they probably do have some kind of warning system. But I do know that when I have transactions that they question. So if I'm doing sort of online transactions, I remember one time I was booking hotels, and a bunch of sort of excursion activities in Finland. And I was actually in Asia at the time. So I'm sitting in Asia booking travels in Finland, and booking several of them. And they were, pretty sort of, they were not cheap. So by about the third booking that I did, my credit card, my phone pinged with my credit card company asking, like, is this you making these transactions? And so that's how they are monitoring things. They're not asking. I do not have to go to someone or go to an app to get pre-approval for every single transaction. I mean, today I used my credit card to buy $3 worth of oranges, and I'm very grateful that I don't have to get some pre-approval to buy three oranges. That's what companies, compliance departments oftentimes are asking their employees to do. So I've been I've been known to say that I'm far less interested in pre-approvals, and I'm far more interested in active monitoring on the back end.
Interesting. Yeah. And then, to your credit limit analogy too, that sort of goes to this whole concept of, are your systems and your processes smart enough to be monitoring and calculating that, on a ongoing basis. So, even when you talk about pre-approvals, and you have companies that do pre-approvals of support, meals, entertainment, with government officials, or, charitable donations and the like, are the systems, sort of disembodied, where every request sort of stands alone, or as part of the approval based on the aggregate amount this government officials received from January 1 of the calendar year, or this charities received? And, so again, using that credit limit analogy, once you've hit a certain threshold of frequency or amount, then it's going to get, escalated for review. But once you're, so long as you're under that, and you're not anomalous in any other sort of way, the analytics aren't showing any sort of other anomalous factor, it's going to get sort of, go through or not even need approval. So, but yeah, it sort of goes to how smart your processes and systems are. And, even factoring in a person's department from their HR record, just taking we haven't really talked about HR data. HR data has a lot of rich data points in terms of, the function someone's in, the department they're in, their seniority. Are you leveraging those data points? Maybe your sales colleagues, you want to look at a different way than your, headquarters employees who don't touch customers at all. And, really a smart system should really enable that type of, use of other data points to make that business ownership more possible. And that's, again, going back to the overall theme here of how digital transformation can really change how you do things and not just, digitize things. So, one of the other points I wanted to, so we were sort of talking about the day-to-day business. What about, the C-suite and even up to the board level? Today, are you feeling like those stakeholders, and I'm sure you get a lot of exposure to folks at that level, or are you feeling like they're getting the right amount of data in most companies today from the compliance functions, or, and if not, what's missing there?
I think that today most companies are getting very sophisticated data in just about everything except compliance. So, I really, I mean, one of the things that that I often do, obviously, is working with companies, and you don't know how often. And one of the things that I routinely review, for example, would be reports that compliance departments make to senior management and boards. And I see the same thing that you would see 10 years ago: the number of investigations, where they are, the number of people, percentage of people who attended and completed training. It's frankly, to me, that training information is utterly useless. It would be far more interesting to me, if I were in senior management, to look at things like the kind of spend patterns, the big pictures when it comes to risk. Where are we seeing the risk based on the data that we are putting together? Not just siloed data sitting in different pockets, but let's put these data together. What is it saying about the where we have our compliance risks today? That kind of data, I see very, very few. I could probably count on, no, I know I can count on one hand with my, and I wouldn't even have to use all 5 fingers on one hand to count the companies where their senior management and board is getting the kind of data that's significantly improved than what they were getting 10 years ago.
Interesting. Yeah, no, and trends and patterns, but also layering on risk, analysis onto that data. Yeah, I think that's critical. And also, from what I've seen, the effort it takes to even get these basic um, data points, like I'm not a big believer in those training stats, which are always hover seemingly, from what I've seen, at 95-96%, at most companies, how much value that adds. But I feel like compliance organizations still spend a lot of time even capturing this data, because the LMS system's not integrated into these other systems to pull this data. So they've got to get manual reports and then put them into a PowerPoint. The amount of time that I spent at companies that I've worked at, let's say, just wrangling this basic data that's not just, again, KPIs and not really data analytics, spending time making PowerPoints that it didn't, realize that I became a compliance professional really to make PowerPoints all day. That stuff can really be solved today with data analytics, with dashboards, like a world where the board and C-suite have a real-time, as you mentioned, a real-time dashboard of their spend, where transactions are risk ranked and markets are risk ranked by their transactional spend, et cetera. That's possible today. And, it's, again, hoping more companies move in that direction for sure. So one of the things I wanted to touch on, because I know you've spoken and written a lot on this, is the behavioral ethics, behavioral sciences side of this. So, all of the emerging research on this, maybe not even emerging at this point, that, compliance organizations are starting to take into account, is fascinating. The fact that everyone thinks that they're more ethical than they really are. And, the research shows that people get less and less ethical as it gets closer to the decision that actually implicates their ethics. The traditional approach of providing an e-learning once a year, where someone's, on their email and clicking through their learning, e-learning until they're finished and they answer these easy quiz questions, and then you get a written policy that you certify to, and then it sits on a shelf. It feels to me like compliance teams aren't really equipping their business in real time and really taking into account that behavioral ethics component, which is 6 months after you've watched the e-learning, your employees watch that e-learning module and put that policy on their shelf, and they're actually faced with that customer requesting that they make a donation to this charity. Are they thinking about things the right way? How do you think about that? How would you advise compliance organizations to really address that, to me, and tell me if you disagree, that sort of yawning gap between how companies are preparing their employees for these ethical questions and how it actually sort of goes down for the business. How do you think about that?
Well, I have to say I'll give credit for this analogy to my friend Ricardo at Broadcat. So to take at least this is the way I interpreted his analogy. If we take the compliance approach on training and apply it to driving, so we would have people come into a driver's ed class once a year or e-learning, and they would go online, they would take the e-learning, and then they go out to the world. There will be no stop signs and no traffic lights.
Yeah.
Right? That's how compliance people would do driving in traffic. It's really, I thinking back certainly to the days when I was doing compliance, especially early years. I was certainly guilty of that, because I was guilty of just teaching people prohibitions and not actually enabling. I'm not teaching them anything new. That it's wrong to bribe, it's wrong to conspire to fix prices with competitors, and that's nothing new. So if I take that driving analogy even further, that driver's ed class wouldn't even teach you anything but say things like, you should drive carefully. So you would go on e-learning, and the e-learning would say things like, you should drive carefully, you should not hit people, you should not collide with other cars, and then send you out into the world with no stop signs and no traffic lights.
Right.
Right. So that's, is it ever, when you think about it, is it any wonder that we continue to have problems? And one of the things that I loved, when I was, and I think, we have this sort of Morgan Stanley case to blame. So this happened, I think, back when you and I were both working at the same company. Morgan Stanley had gotten a sort of big pat on the back because, supposedly this guy Peterson was trained 50,000 times on not bribing, and yet he went and bribed, right? So that became, every compliance officer said, "Oh, this is great. This is great. This is what we need to do, is document how many times we train someone. And this makes us, the best compliance officer." Now putting it, I'm happy to say I was not at DOJ at the time. I don't think DOJ, if I had been there at the fraud section at that time, that I would have certainly tried my very best not to have the scenario play out the way it did. I subsequently, when I was at DOJ, a company with their outside counsel came in and made that exact argument, that Morgan Stanley argument, that the employees, in this case, were trained, 50 times on this. So I looked at the outside counsel and I said, so how am I to interpret the effectiveness of your training when you tell people to do something, not to do something 50 times, and yet they go out to do exactly what you told them not to do? And he just looked at me like, his face was just like, you're not supposed to be asking that question like that. But really, in the real world, that's exactly the question that needs to be posed. If you keep telling people not to do something, yet they continue to do what you tell them not to do, what did you just waste a whole lot of time, right? So what I think people really want is enabling them, is not to say don't bribe or don't collude, but you teach a 25-year-old salesperson what to do when your customer hints at wanting a bribe, what to do when your competitor approaches you and say, let's just agree on a price, right? So it's not realistic to to tell a 25-year-old to say you just walk into your customers with a multi-million-dollar deal on the table, and the customer hints at something and you say, no, we can't do that. That's just not realistic for that to expect the salesperson to do that. But there are skillful, tactful way of doing it, deflecting things and reporting it and working with the right stakeholders to resolve that scenario. We're not teaching them any of that. We're just teaching them you can't do it, and that's not helpful.
And how we're also teaching them, I think embedding it in the processes, embedding it in the day-to-day life of the business
the traffic
person.
lights and the stop sign.
Yeah, exactly, is critical. And really, like the user experience, in the tech, as a lawyer who turned to technology, as now is in the tech space, end user experience is key. People are so used today to very highly intuitive apps outside of work, that are really easy to use, really quick, but the same standards often missing in compliance. In the non-compliance world, if you build a clunky website that doesn't work and you can't upload files and you have to go to 3 different places on the website to do something, they'll give up and they'll go to the next thing. But in the compliance world, your business obviously doesn't have anywhere else to go. Where they will sometimes go is just not through your system, coming up with workarounds, coming up with creative things to sidestep the process. From your perspective and having, worked in a number of companies and advised many, many companies on how the business actually interacts with the compliance function, and, different interfaces and experiences and paper-based things, SharePoint, et cetera, how much of an obstacle is that interface and that experience in your view, between the compliance and the business to actual effective compliance?
Oh, it's huge. I mean, I think, like you said, people are very used to things that are very user friendly in their daily lives, and they just don't. They have less and less patience with clunky systems that that look and that's not user friendly, that look clunky and feel clunky. I remember, again, when I was at the fraud section, there was a company that came in, and one of the things they said was that they had built this compliance intranet site, but people are not using it. So they said they were at least tracking, like, how many times people have access to, but people are not using it. And they said, we have uploaded all of this stuff on there and people are just not using it. So I looked at, I looked at their site and I said, well, let me ask you a question. I think this is why, like, I think there, people always were kind of surprised by the kind of questions I asked. So I said, if you develop a product and people don't buy it, whose fault is that?
Right.
Right? You can't blame the user. I mean, they're not using it. Maybe you should think about why they're not using it. They're not using it because they're bad people, or they're not using it because they don't like you, but they're not using it because it's not easy to use. It's that simple. So I do think it's very important about the credibility. I mean, I think you said at one point in our 3 conversations that, the compliance is a function that nobody wanted to have in the first place. So you really have to build that credibility very judiciously, and you don't do it by making people do unnecessary things. I had a colleague when I was a Standard Chartered, who worked with me, and he said, I want the business to know that when I come and ask them for something, it's only because I have exhausted all other options. And I think he's right, because when business trusts that you would not inconvenience them just to convenience yourself, they will be more likely to cooperate. And by building clunky systems, by making people go through hoops that you could easily have done by extracting data, existing data, are ways that compliance lose credibility within the organization.
Yeah, no, agree fully. I mean that may be a really great place to sort of end the conversation, because I think that leaves, I think our listeners with a lot to think about. I think thank you first so much for all 3 of these sessions. Again, my main driver here is really to help compliance organizations understand that, digital transformations, again, not just about moving things online. It's really changing how compliance operates. And I think you've really illustrated all of those different ways. And so I really hope, this 3-part series that you've been part of, Hui, I hope it helps every compliance organization on their digital transformation journey. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Hui, thank you so much for your time and for your insights.
Thanks for having me.